When Family Guy first premiered back in 1999, Brian Griffin seemed like he was going to be the straight man of the series. He was the voice of reason in a household full of chaos. Peter was an idiot. Lois was trying to hold everything together. The kids were disasters in their own ways. And Stewie was already plotting world domination from his crib. Brian, by contrast, seemed relatively normal. Sure, he was a talking dog who walked on two legs and drove a Prius. But in the context of Family Guy's universe, that was actually pretty tame. He read books. He had intelligent conversations. He seemed to genuinely care about the Griffin family. For the first season or so, you could almost believe that Brian was going to be the moral center of the show. The character who would call out everyone else's nonsense, and maybe teach a lesson or two along the way. But even in those early episodes, if you were paying attention, you could see the cracks starting to form. Brian wasn't just the intellectual family dog. He had problems. Serious problems. Problems that would only get worse as the series went on, and the writers started to Flanderize his character into something much darker and more disturbing than anyone probably expected when they first met this charming talking Labrador. Let's start with the alcoholism, because that's been a consistent part of Brian's character since basically the beginning. Brian drinks constantly. Not socially. Not occasionally. Constantly. He's got a martini in his hand in half the episodes he appears in. He drinks in the morning. He drinks in the afternoon. He drinks at night. He drinks when he's happy. He drinks when he's sad. He drinks when he's bored. The drinking isn't presented as a cute quirk or a harmless character trait. It's presented as an actual addiction that causes real problems in his life and the lives of the people around him. Brian gets drunk and makes terrible decisions. He gets drunk and says things he shouldn't say. He gets drunk and does things that, in any realistic scenario, would land him in jail or at minimum in mandatory rehab. The public intoxication alone is enough to rack up dozens of misdemeanor charges if we're being honest about it. Brian doesn't just drink at home. He drinks at the Drunken Clam, the local bar where Peter and his friends hang out. He drinks at restaurants. He drinks at parties. He drinks while he's out in public spaces around Quahog. And when you're drunk in public, you're breaking the law. It doesn't matter if you're a person or a talking dog. Public intoxication is illegal in Rhode Island, where Quahog is supposedly located. You can get fined. You can get arrested. You can end up with a criminal record. And Brian does this constantly, episode after episode, season after season, with absolutely no consequences. But the drinking is just the foundation. It's the baseline of Brian's problems. What makes it worse is how his alcoholism affects his behavior around the Griffin family. Brian is supposed to be a member of this household. He's supposed to be helping take care of the kids, or at minimum, not making things worse. But there are multiple episodes where Brian is too drunk to function properly, where his drinking actively puts the family in danger, or creates additional problems that someone else has to solve. That's not just addiction. That's negligence. When you're living with children and you're constantly intoxicated to the point where you can't be responsible, that's a form of child endangerment. Brian shares a house with Meg, Chris, and Stewie. His alcoholism means he's not capable of being a responsible adult figure in that household, and yet nobody ever seems to address this in any meaningful way. The ego and hypocrisy were there from the start too, even if they weren't as pronounced in the early seasons. Brian has always thought he was smarter than everyone else. He went to Brown University, though he dropped out before graduating. He reads literary fiction. He writes, or at least he tries to write. He has opinions about politics and religion and culture, and there's nothing wrong with any of that in theory. The problem is that Brian doesn't just have interests and opinions. He weaponizes them. He uses his supposed intellectual superiority to talk down to people, to manipulate situations, to justify his own bad behavior. When Brian does something wrong, he's got an excuse ready. He's got a rationalization. He's got a way to spin it, so that actually, when you think about it, he was the reasonable one, and everyone else was being irrational. This becomes especially obvious in how he treats Peter. Peter is Brian's best friend, supposedly. Peter took Brian in when he was astray. Peter gave him a home and a family. And how does Brian repay that? by constantly making fun of Peter's intelligence, by rolling his eyes at Peter's ideas, by acting like spending time with Peter is this huge burden that he's graciously accepting out of the goodness of his heart. There's this weird dynamic where Brian simultaneously depends on Peter for everything: his home, his food, his entire existence as part of the Griffin family, while also treating Peter like he's barely worth talking to. That's not friendship. That's parasitism with a side of contempt. And then there's the whole situation with Lois. Right from the early seasons, it's clear that Brian has feelings for Lois that go way beyond what's appropriate for your best friend's wife. He's attracted to her. He flirts with her. He makes comments that cross lines. And the show plays this for laughs sometimes, like it's just this funny running gag that the family dog has a crush on the matriarch. But when you actually think about what's happening, it's not funny at all. It's creepy. Brian lives in the same house as Lois. He has constant access to her. He's in a position of trust within the family. And he's using that position to pursue someone who's married to his best friend. Someone who's never shown any real romantic interest in him. Someone who probably feels uncomfortable with his advances, but doesn't want to make things weird because they all live together. This crosses into genuinely problematic territory in later seasons, and we'll get into the specifics of that later. But even in the early episodes, you can see Brian testing boundaries. He makes comments about Lois's appearance. He finds excuses to be physically close to her. He gets jealous when Lois is paying attention to Peter instead of him. This is stalking adjacent behavior at minimum. It's a pattern of behavior that suggests Brian doesn't really understand or respect boundaries when it comes to women he's interested in. And Lois is just the most obvious example because she's right there in the house with him all the time. But the moment that really crystallizes Brian's early criminal behavior comes in the season 1 finale. The episode is called Brian, Portrait of a Dog, and it's supposed to be this heartwarming story about Brian reconnecting with his roots as a dog. What actually happens is that Brian runs away from home and ends up at a dog show. When the Griffins find him and try to bring him home, Brian attacks police officers. Not in a playful way, not by accident. He deliberately attacks law enforcement who are trying to maintain order at a public event. That's assault on a police officer. That's resisting arrest. Those are serious felonies that carry significant prison time in the real world. The show plays it like Brian is just being rebellious, like he's making some kind of statement about his autonomy and his identity. But what he's actually doing is committing violent crimes against people who are just trying to do their jobs. And when the police try to take him into custody, Brian flees. He runs away. That's evading arrest, which is another crime on top of the assault. The legal implications here are significant. In Rhode Island, assaulting a police officer can get you up to 20 years in prison, depending on the circumstances. Resisting arrest can add additional years to that sentence. Brian committed multiple felonies in a single episode and faced absolutely no consequences for it, because the show decided this was all just part of his character development. This is the pattern that gets established early on. Brian does something illegal. Brian faces no real consequences. Brian learns nothing from the experience. And then the next episode, he's back to his normal routine like nothing happened. There's no growth. There's no accountability. There's just Brian continuing to be Brian, which means continuing to break laws and hurt people while maintaining this false image of himself as the intellectual, moral, reasonable member of the Griffin family. The early seasons establish all the foundational elements of Brian's criminal personality. The alcoholism that impairs his judgment and leads to poor decisions. The ego that convinces him he's above the rules that apply to everyone else. The hypocrisy of presenting himself as morally superior while constantly engaging in immoral and illegal behavior. The boundary violations with women, especially with Lois. The willingness to use violence against authority figures when it suits him. These aren't isolated incidents or one-off jokes. These are consistent character traits that define who Brian is and predict the much worse behavior that's coming in later seasons. And what makes it all so insidious is that Brian gets away with it. The other characters rarely call him out in any meaningful way. The show rarely presents his behavior as genuinely problematic. Instead, Brian's flaws are often framed as endearing quirks or understandable imperfections. He's just a little neurotic. He's just got some issues with women. He drinks a bit too much sometimes. The show normalizes behavior that, in any other context, would be clearly unacceptable. And by normalizing it, the show creates space for Brian to get progressively worse as the series continues. These early crimes and personality flaws are important to understand because they're the foundation for everything else. You can't understand why Brian becomes a full-blown criminal in later seasons if you don't understand that he was always heading in that direction. The seeds were planted from the very beginning. The alcoholism, the narcissism, the entitlement, the disregard for boundaries and laws. It was all there in season 1, waiting to grow into something much darker and more disturbing as the writers decided to lean into Brian's worst traits rather than trying to redeem them. Brian's relationship with the broader Quahog community reveals something important about his character. He doesn't just have problems within the Griffin household. He's a menace to society at large. And when we start tallying up the property damage, the vandalism, the reckless behavior that endangers innocent bystanders, and the countless instances of breaking and entering, we start to see a pattern of someone who genuinely doesn't care about other people or their property. Brian moves through Quahog like he owns the place, like the entire town exists for his convenience. And if he happens to destroy something or hurt someone along the way, well, that's just collateral damage in the story of his life. Let's talk about the vandalism first, because it's extensive. Brian destroys property constantly throughout the series. Sometimes it's Peter's stuff, which is bad enough considering Peter is supposed to be his best friend. But often it's other people's property. Random cars, buildings, public spaces, private businesses. Brian has a particular talent for causing destruction when he's drunk, which, as we've established, is most of the time. There's something about Brian's combination of alcoholism and entitlement that makes him especially dangerous to the physical infrastructure of Quahog. The drunk driving episodes alone constitute a series of felonies that should have resulted in Brian losing his license permanently and spending significant time in prison. Brian drives drunk repeatedly throughout the series, not once or twice as a mistake he learns from, but habitually, as a regular part of his character. He gets in his Prius, that smug little environmentally friendly car with the Kucinich bumper sticker, and he drives it while intoxicated, putting everyone on the road at risk. In one episode, he's so drunk he can barely see straight, and he still gets behind the wheel. In another, he crashes into multiple objects while driving home from the bar. The property damage from these drunk driving incidents would be in the tens of thousands of dollars at minimum. But it's not just about the money. Drunk driving kills people. In the real world, roughly 10,000 people die every year in the United States because of drunk drivers. Brian's repeated drunk driving isn't a cute character quirk. It's a serious crime that demonstrates a complete disregard for human life. Every time Brian gets drunk and decides to drive home, instead of calling a cab or walking or literally doing anything else, he's making a choice that could result in someone's death. And he makes that choice over and over again, because Brian fundamentally doesn't believe that bad things will happen to him or that he's responsible for the consequences of his actions. The legal penalties for DUI in Rhode Island are severe, and they should be. A first offense can result in up to a year in jail, a fine of up to $500, and a license suspension of 3 to 18 months. That's just for the first offense. For subsequent offenses, the penalties increase dramatically. By the third DUI, you're looking at mandatory jail time, fines up to $5,000, and a license suspension of 2 to 3 years. Brian has committed enough DUI offenses throughout the series that, if they were prosecuted consecutively, he'd be looking at decades in prison and permanent loss of his driving privileges. And that's before we even factor in the property damage. Every time Brian crashes his car while drunk, that's additional charges. Reckless driving. Destruction of property. If he hits another car, that's vehicular assault. If he damages public property like street signs or guardrails, that's destruction of government property. The charges pile up quickly, and Brian accumulates them like he's collecting trading cards. The hitting cars thing is worth examining more closely because it happens so frequently. Brian doesn't just crash into stationary objects when he's drunk. He hits other people's cars. Sometimes when they're parked. Sometimes when they're driving. He causes accidents that could seriously injure or kill other drivers. And his response is almost never to take responsibility or to check if anyone's hurt. His response is usually to either drive away quickly before anyone can get his information, or to make some sarcastic comment that deflects from the severity of what just happened. There's an episode where Brian gets drunk at the Drunken Clam, drives home, and sideswiped 3 different cars on the way. 3 separate instances of hit and run in a single trip home. Each of those is a separate felony. Hit and run is taken very seriously by law enforcement because it shows a consciousness of guilt. When you hit something and drive away, you're demonstrating that you know you did something wrong, and you're trying to avoid responsibility for it. That's worse than just causing an accident. That's causing an accident and then fleeing the scene, leaving any potential victims without help and without the insurance information they'd need to repair their vehicles or pay their medical bills. The broader chaos Brian causes when he's being reckless is harder to quantify, but equally important. Brian doesn't just destroy individual items or crash into individual cars. He causes chain reaction events that affect entire neighborhoods. There are episodes where Brian's actions lead to fires, explosions, structural damage to buildings, and mass panic among Quahog residents. He's like a one-dog wrecking crew, tearing through the town and leaving destruction in his wake, and then acting surprised when people are upset about it. The breaking and entering is another major category of crime that Brian commits with shocking regularity. Brian has no respect for private property or locked doors. If he wants to be somewhere, he goes there, regardless of whether he's invited or whether it's legal. He jumps into people's homes through windows. He picks locks. He sneaks into buildings after hours. He trespasses on private property constantly. And the show presents this as just another example of Brian being proactive or resourceful, when what he's actually doing is committing felony burglary over and over again. Breaking and entering is a serious crime. In Rhode Island, breaking and entering into a dwelling is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Breaking and entering into a building or ship is punishable by up to 3 years. These aren't minor offenses. These are felonies that demonstrate a willingness to violate other people's privacy and property rights in pursuit of your own goals. And Brian does this constantly, to the point where it's just accepted as part of his character. There's a particular episode where Brian breaks into someone's house in the middle of the night because he's convinced they have something he wants. He doesn't knock. He doesn't call ahead. He doesn't ask permission. He just breaks in through a window like some kind of burglar, rifles through their belongings, and then leaves when he doesn't find what he's looking for. The homeowners wake up and find evidence of the break-in and are understandably terrified that someone violated their home while they were sleeping. But Brian never faces any consequences for this because the show moves on to the next plot point without addressing the very real crime that just occurred. The trespassing scenes are even more frequent than the breaking and entering. Brian wanders onto private property all the time. He goes into businesses after they're closed. He sneaks into restricted areas. He ignores no trespassing signs like their suggestions, rather than legally enforceable warnings. Trespassing might seem like a minor crime compared to some of the other things on Brian's rap sheet, but it's still illegal. And it's still indicative of Brian's fundamental belief that rules don't apply to him. What makes all of this worse is that Brian never seems to learn. He never has that moment of realization where he understands that his actions have consequences for other people. He causes property damage and moves on. He destroys someone's car and forgets about it by the next scene. He breaks into someone's home and never thinks about how violated and unsafe they must feel. Brian exists in this bubble where he's the main character of his own story, and everyone else in Quahog is just background scenery that doesn't really matter. The financial impact of Brian's crimes against Quahog society would be staggering if anyone ever tried to calculate it. The cost of repairing all the cars he's damaged. The cost of fixing all the buildings he's vandalized or destroyed. The cost of replacing all the property he's broken or stolen. The medical bills for anyone who's been injured by his reckless behavior. the therapy bills for all the people whose homes he's broken into, the lost business revenue for establishments that have had to close for repairs after Brian tore through them. If Brian were ever actually held accountable for all the financial damage he's caused, he'd be paying off debts for the rest of his life, even if he lived to be 100 years old in dog years. But Brian will never be held accountable because Family Guy exists in this weird universe where certain characters can do terrible things without facing realistic consequences. Peter can destroy the town and still have his job the next episode. Stewie can commit war crimes and still be treated like a cute baby. And Brian can vandalize, burglarize, and drunkenly demolish his way through Quahog without ever spending a single night in jail or paying a single dollar in restitution. The relationship between Brian and Quahog society is fundamentally parasitic. Brian takes advantage of the town's resources. He uses its roads and businesses and public spaces. He benefits from its infrastructure and services. But he contributes nothing positive in return. He doesn't pay for the damage he causes. He doesn't apologize to the people he hurts. He doesn't modify his behavior to be less destructive. He just keeps taking and taking and taking, destroying and destroying and destroying, secure in the knowledge that somehow he'll never actually have to face any real consequences for any of it. And the worst part is that Brian probably doesn't even realize how much damage he causes. Or if he does realize it, he doesn't care. Because Brian is fundamentally incapable of seeing beyond his own needs and desires. The vandalism, the drunk driving, the property destruction, the breaking and entering, all of it stems from the same root cause. Brian believes he's special. He believes he's smarter than everyone else, more cultured than everyone else, more important than everyone else. And when you believe you're that special, it becomes very easy to justify why the rules that apply to ordinary people don't apply to you. It becomes easy to rationalize why it's okay for you to drive drunk or break into someone's house or destroy their property. Because you're Brian Griffin. You're the intellectual. You're the writer. You're the voice of reason. And surely someone that special should be able to do whatever they want without consequence. If there's one thing that really showcases the depths of Brian's criminal behavior, it's his relationship with drugs. We're not talking about casual, recreational use that stays private and doesn't hurt anyone. We're talking about full-blown addiction, possession of controlled substances, distribution to others, including minors, and driving under the influence of narcotics. Brian's drug crimes are extensive, well documented across multiple episodes, and would carry serious prison time if they were ever prosecuted in any kind of realistic legal system. Let's start with the cocaine, because that's where things get really dark, really fast. In the episode The Thin White Line, Brian becomes a drug-sniffing dog for the Quahog Police Department. This should have been a positive thing. Brian using his natural abilities as a dog to help law enforcement catch criminals and get dangerous drugs off the streets. But of course, because this is Brian we're talking about, it goes horribly wrong almost immediately. During his very first day on the job at the airport, Brian successfully locates a suitcase full of cocaine. Good dog, right? Except Brian doesn't just find the cocaine. He snorts it. He sticks his nose directly into a massive quantity of cocaine and inhales it like he's at some kind of drug buffet. Now, you might think this was an accident. Maybe Brian didn't know what cocaine smelled like. Maybe he was just doing his job and got some of it in his system by mistake. But that's not what happens. Brian knows exactly what he's doing. And once he gets that first taste, he's hooked. Almost immediately, Brian develops a full-blown cocaine addiction. Not a casual habit. Not occasional use. A serious, life-destroying addiction that affects every aspect of his behavior and puts everyone around him in danger. The episode shows Brian's descent into addiction in pretty graphic detail. He becomes aggressive with the Griffin family. He's paranoid. He's erratic. He can't sleep. He can't focus. His entire personality changes because of the cocaine. This isn't played entirely for laughs like some of Brian's other problems. The show actually treats this relatively seriously, showing how addiction can completely take over someone's life and turn them into a different person. Brian goes from being a functioning member of the household to being a genuine threat to the safety of everyone living there. From a legal perspective, what Brian's doing here is absolutely catastrophic. First, there's the possession charge. Brian is in possession of a Schedule II controlled substance. Cocaine possession in Rhode Island can result in up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $5,000 for a first offense. That's just for possession. But Brian isn't just possessing small amounts for personal use. He's stealing evidence from police operations. He's taking cocaine that was supposed to be entered into evidence for criminal prosecutions and using it himself. That's theft of controlled substances from law enforcement, which carries additional charges and much harsher penalties. But it gets worse, because Brian doesn't just use cocaine himself. There are scenes that suggest he's sharing it, or at least not preventing others from accessing his stash. When you distribute cocaine to others, even if you're not selling it, you've crossed over into drug trafficking. That's a federal crime. That's the kind of charge that can put you away for decades, not years. Distribution of cocaine carries mandatory minimum sentences that start at 5 years and go up from there depending on the quantity involved. And given that Brian stole a suitcase full of cocaine, we're talking about quantities that would trigger the harshest possible sentencing guidelines. The cocaine storyline eventually ends with Brian going to rehab, which is good. He recognizes he has a problem and seeks treatment. But here's the thing about addiction and criminal behavior. Going to rehab doesn't erase the crimes you committed while you were using. Brian stole drugs from the police. He possessed illegal narcotics. He used those narcotics repeatedly. He endangered the people around him while he was high. Those are all crimes that should have resulted in arrests, trials, and convictions. Instead, Brian goes to rehab for what seems like a few days, comes back to the Griffin household, and everything goes back to normal, like nothing happened. No criminal charges, no arrest record, no consequences whatsoever beyond a brief stay at a treatment facility. Now let's talk about the marijuana, because that's been an even more consistent presence in Brian's life throughout the series. Brian smokes weed regularly. He's got a stash hidden somewhere in the Griffin house. He's high in numerous episodes, sometimes obviously so, sometimes more subtly. And unlike the cocaine, which is presented as this dark addiction arc, the marijuana use is often played for laughs, like it's just this quirky thing that Brian does because he's a laid-back intellectual type. But here's the thing. For most of Family Guy's run, marijuana was illegal in Rhode Island. It wasn't decriminalized for recreational use until 2022. So for the vast majority of Brian's marijuana use throughout the series, he was committing crimes. Possession of marijuana was a criminal offense that could result in jail time and fines. Brian was breaking the law every single time he smoked up, every time he bought weed from a dealer, every time he transported it from one location to another. The quantities matter too. If Brian is keeping a stash in the house, that's not just simple possession anymore. Depending on how much he has, that could be possession with intent to distribute, which is a much more serious charge. There's an episode where you can see Brian has quite a bit of marijuana stored away, suggesting he's buying in bulk, which further supports an intent to distribute charge even if he's not actually selling it to anyone. And then there's the issue of Stewie. Brian gets Stewie high, multiple times, across multiple episodes. Let me say that again so it really sinks in. Brian Griffin, an adult, gives marijuana to a baby. Stewie might be a genius baby with advanced vocabulary and complex schemes, but legally speaking, he's still a minor. He's still a child. And Brian gives him drugs. That's not just possession. That's distribution of a controlled substance to a minor. That's corruption of a minor. That's child endangerment. Any one of those charges alone could send Brian to prison for years. Combined, we're talking about potential sentences that could easily exceed a decade. There's a specific scene where Brian and Stewie are hanging out, and Brian casually offers Stewie some of his marijuana. Stewie accepts, and they get high together. The show plays this as this funny bonding moment between best friends. But what's actually happening on screen is a felony. An adult giving drugs to a child is one of the most serious drug crimes you can commit because it involves both illegal substances and the exploitation of a minor. Prosecutors take these cases incredibly seriously because they involve vulnerable populations who can't consent to drug use and don't understand the long-term consequences. The fact that Stewie appears to be a willing participant doesn't matter legally. Children can't consent to drug use. The law recognizes that minors don't have the capacity to make informed decisions about controlled substances, which is why there are special enhanced penalties for anyone who gives drugs to people under 18. Brian isn't just committing a drug crime. He's committing a drug crime against a child, and that makes it exponentially worse from a legal and moral standpoint. Then we have to talk about Brian driving under the influence of marijuana. Just like with the alcohol, Brian gets high and then gets behind the wheel of his car. He drives around Quahog while impaired by marijuana on numerous occasions throughout the series. Driving under the influence of any substance, whether it's alcohol or drugs, is illegal. It's dangerous. And it's something Brian does repeatedly without apparent concern for the safety of others or for the legal consequences he should be facing. DUI laws don't distinguish between alcohol and other drugs when it comes to impairment. If you're too impaired to drive safely, whether that impairment comes from alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, or prescription medications, you're breaking the law. The penalties are similar to alcohol-related DUIs. First offense can mean jail time, fines, and license suspension. Subsequent offenses carry increasingly harsh penalties. And Brian, as we've established, is a repeat offender on multiple fronts. There's also the question of where Brian gets his drugs. He has to be buying them from someone. That means he has a dealer. That means there are drug transactions happening, probably regularly, to maintain his supply. Every drug transaction is another crime. Every time Brian meets with a dealer to buy marijuana, or, during his addiction phase, cocaine, that's another instance of possession. Another instance of conspiracy to distribute. Another instance of participating in an illegal drug market. The financial aspect of Brian's drug use is worth considering too. Drugs are expensive, especially when you're using regularly. Brian doesn't have a job most of the time. He occasionally does freelance writing or has brief stints at various positions. But for the most part, he's unemployed and living off the charity of the Griffin family. So where is he getting the money to buy drugs? Is he stealing from Peter and Lois? Is he selling some of his drugs to others to fund his own use? Either way, there are additional crimes being committed here. If he's stealing money from the Griffins to buy drugs, that's theft. If he's selling drugs to others, that's distribution and trafficking. The long-term impact of Brian's drug crimes extends beyond just the legal penalties he should be facing. Drug addiction and drug-related criminal behavior often lead to cascading consequences that affect every aspect of a person's life. Relationships get destroyed. Employment opportunities disappear. Financial stability crumbles. Health deteriorates. Brian experiences some of these consequences during his cocaine addiction arc, but then the show resets everything and he goes back to casual marijuana use, like his brush with hard drugs never happened. In the real world, Brian's drug crimes would have resulted in multiple arrests, multiple convictions, and significant prison time. A person with Brian's history of cocaine possession and use, marijuana possession and distribution, giving drugs to a minor, and repeated instances of driving under the influence would be looking at decades behind bars. The criminal record alone would make it nearly impossible for him to find employment, housing, or maintain any kind of normal life. But in the world of Family Guy, Brian just keeps getting away with it, episode after episode, season after season. What makes Brian's drug crimes particularly egregious is the hypocrisy involved. Brian positions himself as this intellectual, enlightened individual who understands the world better than everyone around him. He lectures people about politics and morality and social issues, but he's actively participating in illegal drug markets, endangering children by giving them controlled substances, and driving impaired while putting innocent people at risk. There's a massive disconnect between how Brian sees himself and what Brian actually is. He thinks he's better than everyone else, but his drug-related behavior proves he's actually worse than most people in Quahog, which is really saying something given how dysfunctional that town is. The drug crimes are also important because they represent a pattern of behavior that goes beyond isolated incidents. This isn't Brian making one mistake and learning from it. This is Brian repeatedly engaging in illegal drug use over years and years, showing no signs of stopping, facing no meaningful consequences, and continuing to act like he's morally superior to everyone around him, despite his ongoing criminal behavior. It's emblematic of everything wrong with Brian as a character. The entitlement, the hypocrisy, the refusal to take responsibility. All of it comes together in his relationship with drugs and the crimes he commits to feed his habits. One of the most consistent relationships throughout Family Guy is the friendship between Brian and Stewie. They go on adventures together. They travel through time. They have deep conversations about life and mortality. On the surface, it's one of the more touching elements of the show. A baby and a dog forming this unlikely bond, understanding each other in ways that the rest of the family doesn't. But when you actually examine what they do together, when you look at the crimes they commit as a team, their relationship becomes deeply disturbing from a legal perspective. Because Brian isn't just friends with a baby. He's friends with a baby who regularly attempts murder, builds weapons of mass destruction, and engages in various forms of terrorism. And Brian doesn't stop him. He helps him. Let's be very clear about what this means legally. When you knowingly help someone commit a crime, you're not just a bystander. You're an accomplice. You're an accessory to whatever crime is being committed. And in many cases, accomplices face the same legal penalties as the primary perpetrator. It doesn't matter if you're the one who actually pulled the trigger, or built the bomb, or kidnapped the victim. If you helped plan it, if you provided materials, if you drove the getaway car, if you did anything to facilitate the commission of the crime, you're legally responsible for that crime. Brian facilitates Stewie's crimes constantly. He's not an innocent bystander who just happens to be around when Stewie does terrible things. He's an active participant in Stewie's criminal enterprises, which makes him legally culpable for everything Stewie does that Brian assists with. The kidnapping charges alone would be enough to send Brian to prison for life. Stewie kidnaps people, multiple people, across multiple episodes, and Brian helps him do it. There's the time they kidnapped various characters to use them in Stewie's experiments or schemes. There's the time they abducted someone because Stewie was angry at them. There's the time they took someone against their will and held them captive while Stewie worked on whatever plan he had going at the time. Each of these is a separate count of kidnapping. Each one carries serious prison time. And Brian is right there helping with every single one. Kidnapping is one of the most serious crimes you can commit short of murder. In Rhode Island, kidnapping can result in life imprisonment. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual maximum penalty. Life in prison. Because kidnapping is recognized as an incredibly traumatic violation that can cause lasting psychological damage to victims. When you take someone against their will, you're not just inconveniencing them. You're terrorizing them. You're making them fear for their life. You're causing trauma that they may never fully recover from. And Brian helps Stewie do this to multiple people without any apparent concern for the victims or understanding of how serious these crimes are. The mechanics of the kidnappings vary, but Brian's role is usually pretty consistent. He provides transportation. He helps restrain the victims. He keeps watch while Stewie does whatever he's planning to do. He offers advice on how to avoid getting caught. He's an active participant in every stage of the crime, from planning to execution to covering up the evidence afterward. There's no way to argue that Brian is just going along reluctantly or doesn't understand what's happening. Brian is a fully informed, willing participant in multiple kidnappings. That makes him guilty of multiple counts of kidnapping, each of which could theoretically result in a life sentence. But the kidnappings are just the beginning. Brian also helps Stewie build weapons. Not regular weapons like guns or knives, though there's probably some of that too. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction. Ray guns, death rays, mind control devices, bombs. Stewie has an entire arsenal of advanced weaponry that violates numerous federal and international laws. And Brian helps him build this stuff. Brian provides materials. He assists with construction. He tests the weapons. He's essentially Stewie's chief engineer and research assistant in the development of weapons that could kill thousands of people. From a legal standpoint, this is conspiracy to commit terrorism. When you help someone build weapons designed to cause mass casualties, you're engaging in terrorist activity. It doesn't matter that Stewie is a baby, or that his plans usually don't succeed. The crime is in the planning and preparation, not just in the execution. Conspiracy charges don't require that the actual crime be completed. You can be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, even if no one actually dies, as long as you took concrete steps toward making the murder happen. Brian takes concrete steps toward helping Stewie build weapons of mass destruction. That's enough for conspiracy charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences of decades in federal prison. There's an episode where Stewie builds a bomb, and Brian helps him transport it to wherever Stewie is planning to use it. They're driving through Quahog with an active explosive device in the car. That's not just conspiracy. That's actual possession and transportation of an explosive device with intent to use it for terrorism. That's multiple federal crimes, each carrying sentences of 20 years or more. If they had been caught, if Quahog had any kind of functional law enforcement that actually investigated crimes, Brian and Stewie would both be in federal prison for the rest of their lives. The attempted murder charges are extensive. Stewie tries to kill Lois multiple times, in multiple episodes. Sometimes the show treats this as canon. Sometimes it treats it as just a running gag. But either way, Stewie is regularly attempting to murder his own mother, and Brian knows about it. Sometimes Brian tries to talk Stewie out of it, which is good. But other times, Brian actively helps with the planning. He gives advice. He points out flaws in Stewie's murder plans. He helps Stewie refine his approach so the murder is more likely to succeed. That's not just knowledge of a crime. That's active participation in attempted murder. Attempted murder is a serious felony that typically carries sentences similar to actual murder, especially when there's clear premeditation and planning involved. The law recognizes that someone who carefully plans and attempts to commit murder is extremely dangerous and needs to be incarcerated to protect society. Brian helps Stewie plan multiple attempts on Lois's life. Each attempt is a separate count of attempted murder. Each count could result in decades in prison. And we're talking about multiple attempts, which means we're talking about multiple life sentences worth of charges if they were ever actually prosecuted. There are also the various assassination attempts Stewie makes on other targets. Sometimes it's characters who have annoyed him. Sometimes it's public figures. Sometimes it's just random people Stewie has decided need to die for whatever reason makes sense in his baby mind. Brian is aware of these plots. He often helps with them. He drives Stewie to locations where assassinations are supposed to take place. He provides equipment. He acts as a lookout. Each of these is another count of conspiracy to commit murder, another instance of aiding and abetting, another crime that Brian should be held accountable for. Time travel episodes add another layer of legal complexity to Brian's role as Stewie's accomplice. When they travel through time, they often make changes to the timeline that result in massive casualties. They've caused alterations that lead to wars, genocides, and catastrophic events that kill thousands or even millions of people. Now, obviously there's no current legal framework for prosecuting time travel-related crimes, but if we're trying to hold Brian accountable for his actions, we have to consider the consequences of what he and Stewie do when they mess with the timeline. There's an episode where their time travel adventures result in a version of history where Native Americans wiped out European colonizers. That's a massive change that would have resulted in countless deaths. Brian and Stewie caused that. They altered the timeline in a way that led to genocide. They eventually fix it, but the fact remains that they engaged in actions that temporarily resulted in mass death. The intent might not have been there initially, but they were reckless with incredibly powerful technology that they knew could have catastrophic consequences. The recklessness is actually a key legal concept here. When you engage in behavior that you know is dangerous, and that behavior results in harm, you can be held criminally responsible, even if you didn't specifically intend for that harm to occur. It's called depraved indifference, or reckless endangerment. Brian knows that Stewie's time machine can cause massive problems. They've experienced those problems firsthand multiple times. But Brian continues to participate in time travel adventures without taking adequate precautions to prevent further damage to the timeline. That's reckless endangerment on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. Beyond the specific crimes we can point to in individual episodes, there's the broader question of Brian's ongoing enabling of Stewie's criminal behavior. Brian knows Stewie is dangerous. He knows Stewie has weapons. He knows Stewie has plans to hurt people. And Brian does nothing to stop it. He doesn't tell Peter and Lois about Stewie's weapons cache. He doesn't disable Stewie's inventions. He doesn't contact authorities. He just lets Stewie continue building bombs and planning murders and engaging in terrorist activities because they're friends, and Brian doesn't want to betray that friendship. But friendship doesn't excuse complicity in serious crimes. If your friend is planning to commit murder, you have a moral and often legal obligation to report them to authorities. Many jurisdictions have laws against misprision of felony, which is basically failing to report a serious crime that you know about. Brian doesn't just fail to report Stewie's crimes. He actively participates in them. He's not just guilty of misprision. He's guilty of aiding and abetting, conspiracy, and being an accessory before and after the fact to literally dozens of serious felonies. The conspiracy charges are particularly important because conspiracy is often easier to prove than the actual underlying crime. To prove conspiracy, prosecutors just need to show that 2 or more people agreed to commit a crime and that at least one of them took some action in furtherance of that agreement. Brian and Stewie clearly agreed to commit crimes together. They plan kidnappings. They discuss how to build weapons. They coordinate their time travel activities. And they take concrete actions to make their plans happen. That's textbook conspiracy. Every conversation they have, where they plan criminal activity, is evidence of conspiracy. Every action Brian takes to help Stewie is an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. The question sometimes comes up whether Brian could claim he was under duress. Maybe Stewie threatened him. Maybe Brian only helps because he's afraid Stewie will hurt him if he doesn't. But that defense doesn't really hold up when you watch the show. Brian and Stewie's relationship is genuinely friendly. Brian helps Stewie because they're best friends, not because he's being coerced. There are episodes where Brian could easily stop participating in Stewie's schemes, or could report Stewie to authorities, but he chooses not to because he values their friendship. That's a choice, and choices have consequences. There's also the issue of Brian's intelligence. Brian is smart. He went to Brown University. He reads literature. He understands complex concepts. He can't claim ignorance about the fact that kidnapping is illegal or that building bombs is wrong. He knows exactly what he and Stewie are doing, and he knows exactly how serious these crimes are. His intelligence actually makes his complicity worse because it eliminates any possibility of arguing that he didn't understand the nature or consequences of his actions. The relationship between Brian and Stewie is often held up as one of the emotional cores of Family Guy, and there are genuinely touching moments between them. The episode Brian and Stewie, where they're locked in a bank vault together and have deep conversations about their friendship, is legitimately moving. But those touching moments don't erase the fact that their friendship is built on a foundation of serious criminal activity. You can't separate the heartwarming aspects of their relationship from the fact that they're accomplices in multiple kidnappings, attempted murders, and terrorist plots. If Brian were ever actually prosecuted for his role as Stewie's accomplice, he'd be facing more prison time than any human could possibly serve. We're talking about multiple life sentences running consecutively. Kidnapping charges, attempted murder charges, conspiracy to commit terrorism, weapons possession, reckless endangerment resulting in death across multiple timelines. The sheer volume of charges would be overwhelming. Brian would need to take a plea deal, and even the most generous plea deal imaginable would still result in him spending the rest of his life in federal prison. But of course, none of that happens. Brian continues to help Stewie commit crimes. Stewie continues to build weapons and plot murders, and the show continues to present their friendship as this sweet, endearing thing rather than the deeply disturbing criminal partnership that it actually is. Brian is Stewie's accomplice in ways that make him legally responsible for some of the most serious crimes depicted anywhere in the series. And he gets away with all of it because Family Guy exists in a universe where babies can build death rays and talking dogs can help them without any consequences whatsoever. Perfect. Now let me generate section 5. 2,500, 3,000 words about Brian and women. If there's one area where Brian's true character really reveals itself in the ugliest possible way, it's in how he treats women. Throughout the entire series, Brian's relationships with women follow a consistent pattern of manipulation, deception, entitlement, and behavior that frequently crosses into criminal territory. We're not just talking about being a bad boyfriend or having commitment issues. We're talking about stalking, harassment, coercion, fraud, and patterns of behavior that would absolutely result in restraining orders and criminal charges in any realistic scenario. Brian's treatment of women is so consistently terrible that it's genuinely one of his most defining character traits, and it gets progressively worse as the series continues. Let's start with Jillian, because she's probably the relationship that gets the most screen time and really demonstrates how Brian operates when he's involved with someone. Jillian is sweet, kind, and not particularly intelligent. Brian starts dating her, and at first, things seem relatively normal. But very quickly, Brian's true feelings about Jillian become clear. He's embarrassed by her. He thinks she's stupid. He makes fun of her behind her back. He complains to other people about how dumb she is. But he stays with her because she's attractive, and because being with an attractive woman makes Brian feel good about himself. This is emotional manipulation and abuse. Brian strings Jillian along in a relationship while secretly having contempt for her. He doesn't respect her as a person. He sees her as an accessory, something pretty to have on his arm that makes him look good. When she talks about things she's interested in, he zones out or makes condescending comments. When she tries to share her thoughts, he dismisses them. The entire relationship is built on Brian's ego and his desire to be with someone who fits his image of what a successful intellectual's girlfriend should look like, with no actual care for Jillian as a human being. The financial exploitation is also there. Jillian comes from a wealthy family. Brian clearly benefits from this. They go on expensive dates that he couldn't afford on his own. She buys him gifts. She provides him with access to a lifestyle that's well beyond his means. Brian is essentially using Jillian for her money, while simultaneously looking down on her for not being as smart as he is. That's a special kind of cruelty. Taking someone's money while thinking you're better than them. Using their generosity while mocking their intelligence. It's parasitic and exploitative, even if it doesn't rise to the level of legally actionable fraud. But the relationship that really showcases Brian's criminal behavior toward women is his obsession with Lois. This isn't a cute crush. This isn't a harmless running gag. This is sustained, years-long stalking behavior directed at his best friend's wife. Brian has been in love with Lois since he moved into the Griffin household. He makes inappropriate comments about her appearance. He fantasizes about her. He tries to create situations where he can be alone with her. He gets jealous when she shows affection to Peter. This goes way beyond having feelings for someone. This is obsessive behavior that makes Lois uncomfortable and violates the trust that should exist between Brian and the entire Griffin family. There are specific episodes where Brian's behavior toward Lois crosses into criminal territory. In Play It Again, Brian tries to actively seduce Lois. He waits until Peter is out of the house. He puts on music. He tries to kiss her. When Lois rejects him, Brian doesn't accept it gracefully. He gets upset. He acts like Lois is being unreasonable for not wanting to cheat on her husband with the family dog. This is sexual harassment at minimum. This is Brian using his position of trust within the household to make unwanted sexual advances towards someone who has never indicated any romantic interest in him. The power dynamic here is crucial. Brian lives in the Griffin house. He's dependent on Peter and Lois for food, shelter, and basically his entire existence. Lois can't easily remove herself from the situation if Brian's advances make her uncomfortable, because they live together. She can't avoid him. She can't get away from him. Every single day, she has to interact with someone who she knows has romantic and sexual feelings for her, someone who has tried to act on those feelings, someone who might try again. That's an incredibly uncomfortable and potentially unsafe position to be in. And Brian created that situation through his own inappropriate behavior. The stalking behavior intensifies in certain episodes. Brian follows Lois. He watches her. He keeps track of her schedule. He manufactures reasons to spend time with her. He inserts himself into her activities. This is textbook stalking. Rhode Island has specific laws against stalking that define it as a pattern of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or substantial emotional distress. Brian's behavior toward Lois absolutely meets that definition. He engages in repeated unwanted contact. He refuses to respect boundaries. He persists in pursuing her, romantically, despite clear rejection. In later episodes, there's an incident where Brian actually cyberstalks a woman. He meets a waitress, becomes obsessed with her after she drew a smiley face on his receipt, and then uses the internet to track down her home address. He shows up at her house uninvited. He stands outside her window watching her. When she discovers him there, she's rightfully terrified. This is criminal stalking. This is behavior that gets people arrested and charged with misdemeanor or felony stalking, depending on the severity, and whether there were any threats involved. Brian's defense, when confronted about this stalking, is that it's the waitress's fault for putting a smiley face on his receipt. He genuinely believes that a woman being friendly to him as part of her job is an invitation for him to track down where she lives and show up uninvited. This reveals something deeply disturbing about how Brian views women and consent. He doesn't understand that women being nice to him in a professional context doesn't mean they want a relationship with him. He doesn't understand boundaries. He doesn't understand that his behavior is threatening and inappropriate. Or worse, he does understand and simply doesn't care because his wants override their right to feel safe. The pattern repeats with practically every woman Brian dates throughout the series. There's Carolyn, his girlfriend, who he lies to about multiple aspects of his life. There's the blind girl he dates while hiding the fact that he's a dog, and then when she discovers the truth and breaks up with him, he returns pretending to be someone else with a different voice, essentially engaging in identity fraud to trick her into dating him again. There's the numerous women he manipulates by pretending to be more successful or educated or wealthy than he actually is. This lying about identity to obtain relationships could arguably constitute fraud. While most lies in dating aren't illegal, there are circumstances where fraudulent misrepresentation to obtain something of value, including sex or money, can be prosecuted. Brian lies about his job, his education, his finances, his achievements, all to make himself seem more desirable. He creates false identities. He tells stories about his life that aren't true. He does this specifically to manipulate women into relationships they wouldn't enter if they knew the truth about who he is. There's also the disturbing pattern of Brian going after much younger women. There are episodes where Brian tries to hook up with high school girls. Now, the show presents these girls as being close to 18, or maybe already 18, but the fact remains that Brian is significantly older and pursuing teenagers. There's a specific episode where Brian goes undercover at Chris's high school and immediately starts flirting with underage students. Even if these girls are technically of legal age, Brian's behavior demonstrates a predatory pattern of seeking out women who are young, naive, and easy to manipulate. The episode with Meg's friend is particularly disturbing. Brian shows no interest in this girl until he accidentally walks in on her changing and sees that she has an attractive body. Suddenly, he's very interested. He starts crafting a fake personality designed to appeal to her. He's willing to lie about who he is and what he believes in order to sleep with this teenager. Meg has to physically stop him from going through with it. Brian was literally seconds away from statutory rape, and his only regret seems to be that he got caught, not that what he was attempting to do was wrong. The coercive behavior shows up repeatedly. Brian doesn't handle rejection well. When women tell him no, he persists. He tries different approaches. He whines. He guilt trips. He tries to wear them down through persistence. This is a form of coercion. When someone says no and you keep pushing, keep trying different tactics, keep refusing to accept their boundary, you're engaging in coercive behavior. You're trying to manipulate them into changing their answer. You're making it clear that their no doesn't actually matter to you. There are also instances where Brian's behavior crosses into territory that could be considered sexual assault. In the Blind Side episode, the implication at the end is that Brian is going to trick his blind ex-girlfriend into having sex with him by pretending to be someone else. That's rape by deception. If someone consents to sex with person A, but you're actually person B, lying about your identity, that's not real consent. That's rape. Brian is planning to commit rape, and the show presents this as a funny punchline rather than the horrific crime it actually is. Brian's treatment of women also extends to how he talks about them when they're not around. He brags about his conquests. He rates women based on their appearance. He reduces them to sexual objects. He shares intimate details about his relationships without the women's consent. This might not be illegal, but it's part of the overall pattern of Brian viewing women as things to be used rather than people deserving of respect. The gold digger behavior is another aspect of Brian's criminal treatment of women. Brian seeks out wealthy women specifically for their money. He dates them not because he's attracted to them or enjoys their company, but because they can provide him with a lifestyle he couldn't afford otherwise. He's not upfront about this. He pretends to have genuine feelings while actually just using them for financial support. This is a form of fraud. When you enter into a relationship under false pretenses, specifically to obtain money or other assets, that's fraudulent behavior. There's also the way Brian uses Lois for various favors and manipulation. He asks her to lie for him. He gets her to help him with his schemes. He plays on her kindness and her desire to help members of the family. This is manipulation and exploitation of someone's good nature. Brian takes advantage of Lois's maternal instincts and her general decency to get what he wants, all while harboring inappropriate feelings for her that make his manipulation even more insidious. The sexual harassment at work comes up in the episode where Brian gets a job at a suicide hotline. He Facebook stalks a female coworker, looking through her photos, and then masturbates to pictures of her family at a funeral. When she catches him, he's mortified, but his solution isn't to apologize genuinely and change his behavior. His solution is to frame her for drug use, to avoid facing consequences for his sexual harassment. He plants drugs in her purse and gets her arrested. This is multiple crimes: sexual harassment, evidence tampering, false accusation, conspiracy to frame someone for a crime. All because Brian couldn't control his sexual impulses at work and couldn't face accountability for his actions. Every relationship Brian has eventually ends the same way. The woman discovers who he really is, realizes he's been lying or manipulating or taking advantage of them, and leaves. Brian never learns from this. He never reflects on his pattern of behavior and thinks maybe he should try being honest and respectful. Instead, he just moves on to the next woman and starts the cycle over again. Lie about who you are. Manipulate them into a relationship. Take what you can get from them. Get discovered. Get dumped. Repeat. The Valentine's Day episode, where all of Brian's ex-girlfriends confront him about his behavior, is telling. They list his flaws. They talk about how he mistreated them. They explain all the ways he hurt them. And Brian's response is to get defensive. He doesn't apologize sincerely. He doesn't acknowledge that they're right. He doesn't commit to changing. He just makes excuses and tries to deflect blame. This is the response of someone who fundamentally doesn't believe he's done anything wrong. Someone who thinks his wants and needs are more important than the harm he causes to others. Brian's crimes against women are extensive, varied, and deeply disturbing. Stalking, harassment, sexual assault, fraud, identity theft, manipulation, coercion, evidence tampering to cover up sexual harassment, attempted statutory rape. The list goes on and on. These aren't just character flaws or personality quirks. These are serious crimes that demonstrate a pattern of predatory behavior toward women. Brian sees women as objects to be pursued, conquered, and discarded. He doesn't respect their autonomy, their boundaries, or their humanity. and he faces virtually no consequences for any of it, which allows him to continue the same destructive pattern relationship after relationship, victim after victim, crime after crime. While Brian's violent crimes and drug offenses are serious, his white-collar criminal activity reveals another dimension of his character that's equally disturbing in its own way. These are the crimes that require planning, deception, and a sustained willingness to defraud people for personal gain. Brian doesn't just hurt people in the heat of the moment or while under the influence. He carefully constructs elaborate schemes to steal money, evade taxes, and manipulate systems for his own benefit. This calculated criminality shows that Brian's problems go beyond impulse control or addiction. He's willing to deliberately and methodically commit fraud when he thinks he can get away with it. Let's start with the tax fraud, because that's one of those crimes that Brian has almost certainly been committing continuously throughout the entire series. Brian occasionally claims to be a writer. He has published at least one book, though it was a commercial failure initially. He does freelance work sometimes. He has income, or at least he claims to have income when it's convenient for him. But there's no indication anywhere in the series that Brian pays taxes on any of this income. He doesn't file tax returns. He doesn't withhold money for the IRS. He just collects whatever money he makes and spends it without accounting for his legal obligation to pay taxes. Tax evasion is a serious federal crime. It's not just failing to pay what you owe. It's actively concealing income and deceiving the government about your financial situation. The IRS takes tax evasion very seriously because the entire tax system depends on voluntary compliance and honest reporting. When people like Brian cheat on their taxes, it shifts the burden onto everyone else who actually pays what they owe. Tax evasion can result in up to 5 years in federal prison and fines of up to $250,000. And that's for each year you fail to file or file fraudulently. Brian has been living with the Griffins for over 20 years of showtime. If he's been evading taxes that entire time, he's looking at decades in prison and millions in fines and penalties. But the tax issues are just the beginning. Brian's attempts at being a writer reveal multiple layers of fraud that go beyond simple tax evasion. His first book, Faster Than the Speed of Love, is apparently terrible. It gets rejected by publishers. Nobody wants to buy it. Brian eventually self-publishes it, and it sells almost no copies. This is humiliating for Brian, who sees himself as a great intellectual and artist. But instead of accepting that maybe he's not as talented as he thinks he is, Brian doubles down and starts engaging in increasingly fraudulent behavior to maintain his image as a successful writer. The whole wish it, want it, do it situation is fraud from start to finish. Brian writes a self-help book that's essentially plagiarized from common self-help tropes. There's nothing original or valuable in it. It's generic advice, repackaged with Brian's pretentious writing style. But Stewie manages to get it published by lying to publishers about its contents and potential market appeal. The book becomes a bestseller not because it's good, but because of manipulative marketing and Stewie's behind-the-scenes machinations. Brian takes credit for this success, despite knowing that the book's popularity is built on deception. Once the book is successful, Brian becomes insufferable. He goes on talk shows. He does book tours. He presents himself as this wise guru who has profound insights into human behavior and success. But it's all a lie. Brian doesn't have special knowledge. He hasn't achieved the kind of success he's telling other people how to achieve. He's essentially running a con, selling false hope to desperate people who think his book will change their lives. This is fraud. When you sell a product by making false claims about its effectiveness, especially when that product is supposed to help people improve their lives, you're committing consumer fraud. The financial gains Brian receives from this fraud are substantial. He makes money from book sales. He gets paid for speaking engagements. He receives advances for future books. All of this money is obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation of his expertise and the value of his advice. In a just world, everyone who bought his book would be entitled to refunds, and Brian would be required to return all the money he made from it. But of course, that doesn't happen. Brian gets to keep the money even after he's publicly exposed as a fraud on Bill Maher's show. The exposure on Bill Maher is actually really important because it demonstrates that Brian knows he's a fraud. When Marr challenges him and points out the contradictions in his book and his life, Brian has no good answers. He can't defend his work because there's nothing to defend. He's forced to admit that he hasn't actually achieved any of the things he's telling other people to do. But even after this public humiliation, Brian doesn't return the money he made from his fraudulent book. He just slinks away and eventually tries to rebuild his reputation so he can commit more fraud in the future. The charity scams are another category of white-collar crime that Brian engages in. There are episodes where Brian gets involved with charitable organizations, not because he genuinely cares about the causes they support, but because he sees them as opportunities to benefit himself. He uses charity events to meet women. He embezzles from charitable funds. He takes donations that were meant for people in need and uses them for his own purposes. This is particularly despicable because charity fraud doesn't just hurt an abstract organization. It directly harms vulnerable people who are supposed to receive help. Charity fraud is prosecuted aggressively when authorities catch it because it undermines public trust in legitimate charitable organizations. When people hear about charity fraud, they become less likely to donate to any charity, even honest ones. This means that Brian's crimes don't just affect the specific organization he defrauded. They contribute to a broader climate of distrust that hurts everyone who relies on charitable giving. Penalties for charity fraud can include significant prison time and orders to pay full restitution to the victims, which in this case would be the people who were supposed to benefit from the charitable work. Identity theft shows up multiple times in Brian's criminal record. There are episodes where Brian pretends to be someone else to obtain benefits or opportunities he wouldn't get using his real name. Sometimes he creates entirely fictional identities. Sometimes he steals the identities of real people. Either way, this is identity theft, which is a federal crime that can result in up to 15 years in prison under the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. The false income reporting ties back to the tax fraud, but deserves its own mention. When Brian does claim income, he often inflates it to seem more successful than he actually is. This is fraud when he's using these false income claims to obtain credit, impress women, or gain access to opportunities reserved for people at certain income levels. Banks and other institutions rely on accurate income information to make lending decisions. When Brian lies about his income to get approved for loans or credit cards, he's committing bank fraud, which is a federal offense that can result in up to 30 years in prison and fines of up to $1 million. There's also the issue of Brian's resident status. He lives with the Griffins rent-free. He doesn't contribute to household expenses in any meaningful way. He's essentially squatting, though Peter and Lois have allowed him to stay, so it's not illegal squatting per se. But when Brian files for government benefits or fills out applications that ask about his housing situation, he has to be misrepresenting his living circumstances. He can't honestly claim to be paying rent or mortgage when he's living for free in someone else's house. This is fraud on whatever applications or forms he's filling out that ask about housing. The writing scams extend beyond just the self-help book. Brian constantly claims to be working on novels, screenplays, and other writing projects. He uses these claims to explain why he doesn't have a regular job. He tells people he's too busy with his writing career to do normal work, but these projects rarely materialize into anything real. Brian is essentially running a long-term scam on the Griffin family, pretending to be a working writer so they'll continue to support him financially while he actually does very little productive work. There's an episode where Brian gets a television show made from one of his scripts. The network buys his pilot, which should be a huge success for him. But the network changes everything about his show, turning his serious drama into a lowest common denominator sitcom. Brian is outraged by this and eventually quits. But here's the thing. Brian took money for that pilot. He was paid for his script. And when the show was changed into something he didn't like, he didn't return the money. He kept the payment for a script that he then disavowed and claimed wasn't his real vision. That's arguably fraud. When you take payment for creative work and then publicly distance yourself from that work to protect your reputation, while keeping the money, you're engaging in a form of fraudulent misrepresentation. The various jobs Brian gets and quickly loses throughout the series also involve elements of fraud. Brian lies on job applications. He claims to have qualifications he doesn't have. He pretends to have experience he doesn't have. When employers hire him based on these false claims, that's fraud. Brian is obtaining employment through deception, and when he receives payment for work he was only hired to do because of his lies, that's theft by deception. There's also fraud in how Brian presents himself professionally. His business cards, his author bio, his professional communications all contain false or exaggerated information about his accomplishments. He claims to have graduated from Brown University when he actually dropped out before completing his degree. He lists achievements he didn't earn. He creates an entirely fictional version of himself that's more successful and accomplished than the real Brian. This is fraud when it's used to obtain professional opportunities or to convince people to do business with him. The relationship between Brian's white-collar crimes and his ego is important to understand. Brian commits these frauds not just because he needs money, though he certainly does, but because he needs to maintain his self-image as a successful intellectual. He can't handle being seen as a failure. He can't accept that maybe he's not as smart or talented as he thinks he is. So he lies. He cheats. He commits fraud. He builds a house of cards made of fake accomplishments and stolen credentials and false claims, all to avoid facing the reality that he's actually kind of mediocre at most things he tries to do. What makes Brian's white-collar crimes particularly insidious is that they're often harder to detect and prosecute than his more obvious crimes. When Brian gets drunk and crashes his car, everyone can see that crime happen. But when Brian evades taxes or commits fraud or engages in identity theft, those crimes happen on paper. They happen in conversations and transactions that aren't witnessed by large groups of people. They're crimes of documentation and deception rather than violence or destruction. But they're no less serious. In fact, the calculated nature of these crimes makes them more disturbing in some ways because they show premeditation and planning. Brian's white-collar criminal activity also demonstrates that his problems aren't just about addiction or impulse control. He's not just making bad decisions in the moment. He's making sustained, deliberate choices to commit fraud over extended periods of time. He files false tax returns year after year. He maintains fraudulent professional credentials throughout his career. He engages in long-term scams that require him to consistently lie and deceive people. This isn't someone who occasionally makes mistakes. This is someone who has built his entire adult life on a foundation of fraud and deception. The financial impact of Brian's white-collar crimes is significant. Between the unpaid taxes, the fraudulent book sales, the charity scams, the identity theft, and all the other fraudulent activity, Brian has probably stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of the series. That's money that should have gone to the government, to charitable causes, to the legitimate owners of the identities he stole, and to the people he defrauded with his fake expertise. Brian has left a trail of financial victims throughout Quahog and beyond, people and institutions that lost money because of his criminal behavior. If Brian were ever actually prosecuted for his white-collar crimes, he'd be facing decades in federal prison. Tax evasion, fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, charity fraud, these are all serious federal offenses with mandatory minimum sentences. The aggregate sentence for all of Brian's white-collar criminal activity could easily exceed 50 years. And unlike violent crimes where parole might be possible, white-collar criminals often serve a higher percentage of their sentences because they're considered calculated offenders who are likely to reoffend if released. Brian would probably die in prison if he were actually held accountable for all of his white-collar crimes. One of the most hypocritical aspects of Brian's character is how he treats other animals. Here's a dog, a literal animal, who constantly advocates for animal rights when it's convenient for him. He positions himself as someone who cares about creatures and the environment. He drives a Prius. He talks about vegetarianism. He lectures people about treating animals humanely. But when you actually look at how Brian treats other animals, especially other dogs, the hypocrisy becomes almost breathtaking. Brian has engaged in discrimination, abuse, and even violence against his own species, all while maintaining this false image of himself as someone who cares about animal welfare. Let's start with Brian's superiority complex when it comes to other dogs. Brian doesn't see himself as a dog, or rather, he sees himself as fundamentally different from and better than other dogs. He walks on two legs, he talks, he reads books, and drinks martinis. In his mind, these things make him not really a dog, or at least not like those other dogs who act like animals. This attitude manifests as genuine discrimination and contempt toward dogs who behave in more typical canine ways. When Brian encounters dogs who don't talk or walk upright, he treats them as inferior. He looks down on them. He's embarrassed by them. He actively distances himself from anything that would associate him with regular dog behavior. This species-based discrimination is particularly gross because Brian benefits enormously from being a dog when it suits him. He gets away with behavior that would never be tolerated from a human. People make allowances for him because he's just a dog. He gets sympathy and special treatment. But the moment he encounters other dogs who don't have his advantages, he treats them with contempt rather than solidarity or compassion. It's like someone from a marginalized group who manages to achieve some success and then immediately turns around and looks down on everyone else from that same group who hasn't achieved the same level of acceptance from the dominant society. The abusive interactions Brian has with other dogs are extensive throughout the series. There are episodes where Brian physically harms other dogs. Sometimes it's played for laughs, like Brian getting into a fight with another dog at a dog park. But physical violence against other animals is animal cruelty, and it doesn't matter that Brian himself is an animal. When you deliberately harm another creature, that's abuse. Brian uses his intelligence and his human-like characteristics to bully and intimidate dogs who can't defend themselves the same way he can. There's a particularly disturbing episode where Brian kills another dog, not accidentally, not in self-defense. He deliberately murders another dog named Dylan's dog, though the exact circumstances vary depending on which episode and timeline we're talking about. But the point is that Brian commits what amounts to murder of another sentient being who happens to be a dog. This isn't euthanasia or putting down a dangerous animal. This is Brian ending another life because that other dog was somehow inconvenient to him or threatening his interests. From a legal perspective, killing someone's pet is a crime. It's destruction of property at minimum, since pets are legally considered property in most jurisdictions. But many states and municipalities have been moving toward treating serious animal abuse as felony offenses that carry substantial prison time. Deliberately killing a dog could result in felony animal cruelty charges, which in some jurisdictions can mean up to 5 years in prison and fines of up to $10,000. The fact that Brian himself is a dog doesn't excuse or mitigate this crime. If anything, it makes it worse because Brian should understand better than anyone what it means to be a sentient dog and how wrong it is to end that life. The dogfighting participation is another level of horror entirely. There's an episode that implies Brian has been involved in underground dogfighting, either as a participant or as someone who attended these events. Dogfighting is one of the most serious forms of animal cruelty. It's a federal felony under the Animal Welfare Act. People who participate in dogfighting, whether as fighters, organizers, or spectators, face up to 5 years in federal prison and fines of up to $250,000. The fact that dogfighting involves animals being trained to fight each other for entertainment makes it particularly barbaric, and Brian's involvement in this world, even tangentially, is absolutely damning. What makes Brian's participation in dogfighting even worse is the betrayal it represents. Dogfighting exists because humans exploit dogs for entertainment and gambling. Brian, as a talking dog with human intelligence, should be fighting against dogfighting with every ounce of his energy. He should be exposing dogfighting rings. He should be rescuing dogs from that world. Instead, he participates in it. He becomes part of the system that abuses and kills dogs for profit and entertainment. That's not just illegal. That's a profound moral betrayal of his own species. The neglect of dog responsibilities is more subtle, but equally revealing about Brian's character. Brian enjoys the benefits of being a dog when it's convenient. He gets adopted by a nice family. He gets free food and shelter. People pet him and call him a good boy. But Brian refuses to accept any of the limitations or expectations that come with being a dog. He doesn't want to be seen as a pet. He doesn't want to follow rules that apply to dogs. He gets offended when people treat him like an animal, even though he literally is an animal. This means that Brian skirts responsibilities in ways that cause real harm to other dogs. There are leash laws and licensing requirements and vaccination mandates that exist to protect both dogs and the broader community. Brian ignores most of these. He doesn't keep his vaccinations current. He doesn't follow leash laws. He doesn't respect spaces where dogs aren't allowed. And when his violations of these rules lead to other dogs being punished or restricted, Brian doesn't care. He got what he wanted. And if other dogs suffer because his behavior reinforced negative stereotypes about dogs, well, that's their problem, not his. There's also the way Brian treats his own family members who are dogs. His mother, before she died and was turned into a table, was a regular dog who couldn't talk or walk upright. Brian was embarrassed by her. He didn't want his friends to meet her because she acted like a dog. His own mother. The person who gave birth to him. And Brian was ashamed of her because she didn't meet his standards for how a dog should behave if they want to be worthy of respect. That's not just sad. That's cruel. Brian abandoned his relationship with his mother because she reminded him of the parts of his identity that he wanted to reject. The discrimination extends to how Brian talks about other dogs when they're not around. He makes jokes about dogs being stupid. He refers to regular dogs as inferior. He uses acting like a dog as an insult. Brian has internalized a hierarchical worldview where talking, bipedal dogs like him are at the top and regular dogs are at the bottom. This isn't just personal preference. This is systematic discrimination against members of his own species based on characteristics they can't control. The encouraging harm to animals goes beyond just dogs. There are episodes where Brian is complicit in or directly encourages harm to various animals. Sometimes it's played as a joke, like Brian suggesting someone kill a pest animal. But Brian's casual attitude toward animal suffering reveals that his supposed advocacy for animal rights is completely hollow. He only cares about animals when caring about them makes him look good, or supports his political positions. When actually helping animals would require personal sacrifice or inconvenience, Brian is nowhere to be found. There's an episode involving Stewie's teddy bear Rupert, where Brian, in a jealous rage, tears Rupert to shreds. Now, Rupert is a stuffed animal, not a living creature, but the incident reveals Brian's capacity for destructive violence toward objects that other people care about. More importantly, there are implications that Brian has hurt actual animals in fits of rage or jealousy. The way Brian savagely destroys Rupert suggests that this isn't the first time he's engaged in this kind of destructive behavior, and it might not always have been directed at inanimate objects. The species betrayal aspect of Brian's crimes against other animals can't be overstated. Brian had a unique opportunity to be a bridge between humans and animals. He could have used his ability to communicate with both groups to advocate for better treatment of animals. He could have explained to humans what it's like to be a dog, helped them understand animal perspectives, and worked to improve conditions for pets and wild animals alike. Instead, Brian uses his unique position to advance only his own interests. He's willing to throw other animals under the bus whenever it benefits him. The legal implications of Brian's treatment of other animals are serious. Animal cruelty laws have become much stricter over the past few decades, as society has recognized that animal abuse is both inherently wrong and often a predictor of violence toward humans. Many jurisdictions now treat serious animal abuse as a felony. Brian's deliberate killing of another dog, his participation in dogfighting, his abuse of other animals, all of these would likely result in felony charges if they were prosecuted. He'd be looking at years in prison and would likely be prohibited from owning or living with animals after his release. There's also the psychological dimension of animal abuse that's worth considering. Research has consistently shown that people who abuse animals are much more likely to commit violent crimes against humans. Animal abuse is often one of the early warning signs of someone who's capable of serious violence. Brian's willingness to harm other animals, particularly other dogs, suggests a capacity for violence and a lack of empathy that extends beyond just his treatment of animals. It's part of the broader pattern of Brian caring only about himself and being willing to hurt anyone or anything that gets in his way. The hypocrisy is really the worst part of all of this. Brian presents himself as morally superior. He lectures people about ethics and justice and compassion. He positions himself as someone who cares deeply about important issues, including animal welfare. But his actions completely contradict his words. He abuses the very creatures he claims to care about. He discriminates against members of his own species. He participates in some of the most barbaric forms of animal cruelty that exist. And then he has the audacity to act like he's better than everyone else because he read a book about philosophy or listened to NPR. If there's one area where Brian's crimes reveal his true character, it's in how he treats other animals. You can learn a lot about someone by how they treat those who have less power than them. And Brian consistently treats powerless animals with contempt, violence, and cruelty. He's a dog who hates dogs, an animal who abuses animals, a creature who betrays his own species for personal gain. And that might be the most damning thing about Brian Griffin of all. When we talk about Brian's violent crimes, we're entering territory that moves beyond fraud and manipulation into acts that directly threaten people's lives. Brian has attempted murder multiple times throughout the series. He's killed at least one sentient being on screen. He's engaged in violence that resulted in serious injuries. And perhaps most disturbingly, he's done all of this while maintaining his facade as the intellectual, reasonable member of the Griffin family. Brian's capacity for violence reveals something deeply disturbing about his character, something that goes beyond addiction or moral weakness. We're talking about someone who is capable of attempting to end another person's life when he feels sufficiently justified in doing so. Let's start with the most clear-cut case of murder that Brian commits. There's an episode where Brian deliberately kills another dog. The circumstances around this vary depending on which version of events we're looking at, but the core fact remains that Brian ends another sentient life. This isn't an accident. This isn't self-defense. This is premeditated murder. Brian makes a conscious decision that another dog needs to die, and then he makes that happen. The victim is a dog who was involved with one of Brian's love interests, which means the motive is jealousy and romantic competition. Brian literally commits murder because he can't handle the fact that a woman he's interested in is with someone else. From a legal perspective, killing a sentient being is murder. It doesn't matter that the victim happens to be a dog in a universe where dogs can talk and think and feel just like humans. Brian kills someone who has thoughts, feelings, relationships, and a life they want to continue living. That's murder. First-degree murder, actually, because there's clear premeditation. Brian doesn't stumble into this killing. He plans it. He thinks about it. He decides that this other dog needs to die, and then he executes that plan. First-degree murder carries a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole in Rhode Island. Brian should be spending the rest of his life behind bars for this single crime alone. The attempted murder of Quagmire is another major incident that demonstrates Brian's capacity for lethal violence. Brian and Quagmire have a contentious relationship, which is putting it mildly. Quagmire openly hates Brian and has delivered a famous monologue explaining exactly why he thinks Brian is a terrible person. That monologue, by the way, is devastatingly accurate. Quagmire calls out Brian's pretentiousness, his poor treatment of women, his lack of genuine accomplishment, all of it. But instead of taking this criticism as an opportunity for self-reflection, Brian holds a grudge. And that grudge eventually manifests as attempted murder. There are multiple episodes where Brian tries to harm or kill Quagmire. Sometimes it's played as comedy, like Brian repeatedly defecating on Quagmire's lawn, which is actually vandalism and could be considered harassment. But there are darker moments where Brian's actions cross into genuinely trying to end Quagmire's life or cause him serious harm. The most notable incident involves Brian tricking Quagmire into buying a terrible apartment in a dangerous neighborhood, knowing that this will likely result in Quagmire being robbed, assaulted, or worse. While Brian doesn't directly attempt to kill Quagmire in this instance, he deliberately puts Quagmire in a life-threatening situation, which legally could be considered attempted murder or at minimum assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. The legal concept of depraved indifference is relevant here. When you do something that you know is likely to result in someone's death, even if you don't specifically intend for them to die, you can be charged with depraved indifference murder. Brian's actions toward Quagmire often fall into this category. He does things that he knows could result in Quagmire's death, and he does them anyway because he doesn't care if Quagmire lives or dies. That's depraved indifference, and it's prosecuted as seriously as intentional murder in many jurisdictions. Now, let's talk about the times Brian has tried to kill Stewie, because yes, that's happened too. Despite their friendship, despite all the adventures they've shared, there have been moments where Brian has genuinely tried to harm or kill Stewie. Sometimes these attempts come during arguments or conflicts between them. Sometimes they're more calculated. But the fact remains that Brian has attempted to murder a baby on multiple occasions. A baby who considers him a best friend. A baby who has saved Brian's life multiple times. And Brian has tried to kill him. The legal and moral implications of attempting to kill a child are even more severe than standard murder charges. Most jurisdictions have enhanced penalties for crimes committed against children because society recognizes that children are particularly vulnerable and deserve special protection. Attempted murder of a child can result in sentences that are even longer than attempted murder of an adult. Brian would be looking at decades in prison just for his attempts on Stewie's life, and that's before we even factor in all the other crimes on his record. There's also the category of negligent homicide, which applies to situations where Brian's reckless behavior resulted in someone's death, even though he didn't specifically intend to kill them. The drunk driving alone creates numerous opportunities for negligent homicide. Every time Brian drives drunk, he's creating a situation where he could easily kill someone. And there are episodes where his drunk driving causes accidents that could have resulted in deaths. The fact that nobody dies on screen doesn't mean Brian isn't guilty of creating those life-threatening situations through his negligent behavior. The distinction between attempted murder and negligent homicide is important legally. Attempted murder requires intent. You have to actually be trying to kill someone. Negligent homicide or vehicular manslaughter occurs when your reckless behavior results in death, even though you didn't intend for anyone to die. Brian is guilty of both. He has moments where he clearly intends to kill someone, like with the other dog or his attempts on Quagmire. But he also has countless moments where his reckless drunk driving, his careless handling of dangerous situations, and his general disregard for safety create circumstances where people could easily die. There's an episode where Brian and Stewie are trying to save Meg, and Brian gets a hold of a gun. He successfully shoots several bad guys, which in that context might be justified as self-defense or defense of others. But then, just for target practice, just because he wants to show off, Brian takes a shot at a waiter on a nearby ship and kills him. This is murder. This is Brian shooting and killing an innocent person who posed no threat to anyone, just because Brian felt like taking a shot. The waiter's death is played as a joke in the episode, but what Brian did is textbook murder. He deliberately shot and killed an innocent person for no reason other than his own amusement. This murder is particularly revealing because it happens during a situation where Brian actually has legitimate reasons to be using a weapon. They're saving Meg from danger. Brian has just successfully defended everyone by shooting actual threats. But the moment the immediate danger passes, Brian's true nature comes out. He can't just put the gun down and be grateful that everyone's safe. He has to keep shooting. He has to kill someone else just to satisfy his own ego. That's not someone having an understandable lapse in judgment during a high-stress situation. That's someone who fundamentally doesn't value other people's lives. The various instances where Brian has endangered people through his criminal negligence are too numerous to count individually. but they form a pattern that's important to understand. Brian regularly creates situations where people could die. He drives drunk. He handles weapons carelessly. He starts fires. He causes explosions. He engages in reckless behavior that puts innocent bystanders at risk. And when people get hurt or almost die because of his actions, Brian rarely takes responsibility. He makes excuses. He blames others. He acts like it wasn't really his fault, even though his choices directly led to the dangerous situation. There's a legal concept called felony murder that applies when someone dies during the commission of a felony, even if the death wasn't intended. For example, if Brian is driving drunk, which is a felony, and someone dies as a result of an accident he causes, that's felony murder. Brian can be charged with murder even though he didn't intend to kill anyone, because the death occurred during the commission of a felony. Given how many felonies Brian commits on a regular basis, the opportunities for felony murder charges are extensive. It's honestly remarkable that more people haven't died as a direct result of Brian's criminal behavior. The psychological aspect of Brian's capacity for violence is worth examining. Brian sees himself as civilized, educated, above the crude violence that characterizes characters like Peter or Quagmire. But when Brian does commit violence, it's often more calculated, and in some ways more disturbing than the cartoonish violence of other characters. Peter gets into fights with a giant chicken, but it's almost slapstick. Brian's violence is personal. It's targeted. It comes from a place of genuine malice, rather than just cartoon chaos. When Brian tries to kill someone, it's because he's decided that person deserves to die, or that their death would benefit him in some way. The premeditation is key here. Brian doesn't just lash out in anger and accidentally hurt someone. He thinks about it. He plans it. He considers different approaches. He makes calculated decisions about how to harm or kill people in ways that will achieve his goals. This cold, calculating approach to violence is more characteristic of serious criminals than it is of someone who just has anger management issues. Brian's violence isn't about losing control. It's about making deliberate choices to hurt or kill people when he decides it's justified. There's also the issue of Brian learning from violence, or using it as a tool. After Brian discovers that he can use violence to get what he wants, or to remove obstacles from his path, he becomes more willing to resort to violence in the future. This is how people become habitual, violent offenders. They learn that violence works for them, that it solves their problems, and so they keep using it. Brian's progression from relatively non-violent in early seasons to increasingly violent in later seasons suggests this kind of escalation. He's learning that he can hurt or kill people and face no consequences, so he becomes more willing to do it. The impact on victims and potential victims of Brian's violence is something that often gets overlooked in discussions of his character. When Brian attempts to murder someone, that person has to live with the trauma of knowing that someone tried to kill them. When Brian's drunk driving nearly causes a fatal accident, the people involved have to deal with the psychological aftermath of almost dying because of someone else's recklessness. When Brian kills that innocent waiter, that person had family and friends who lost someone they loved because Brian wanted to show off. These aren't victimless crimes. These are acts that cause real suffering to real people, even if they're cartoon people in a cartoon universe. The legal penalties for Brian's violent crimes would be catastrophic if they were ever actually prosecuted. One count of first-degree murder means life without parole. Multiple counts of attempted murder could each carry 20 to 30 years. The negligent homicide charges could add another 10 to 15 years per incident. The assault charges, the reckless endangerment charges, the felony murder charges, they all stack up. Brian would need multiple lifetimes to serve all the prison time he's earned through his violent criminal behavior. He would die of old age in prison multiple times over if the justice system actually functioned in the Family Guy universe. What makes Brian's violent crimes particularly troubling is that they're often motivated by petty grievances. He tries to kill Quagmire because Quagmire doesn't like him. He kills another dog because of romantic jealousy. He endangers people through drunk driving because he can't be bothered to call a cab. These aren't crimes of passion in the heat of an intense moment. These are crimes that stem from Brian's inability to handle minor setbacks and interpersonal conflicts in any kind of mature, non-violent way. Brian's violence reveals someone with a fundamentally broken moral compass, someone who sees lethal violence as an acceptable response to everyday problems. The time travel and multiverse episodes add an entirely new dimension to Brian's criminal record, one that operates on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. We're not just talking about crimes against individuals or even crimes against Quahog anymore. We're talking about crimes against entire timelines, alternate realities, and potentially all of existence. Brian and Stewie's adventures through time and across dimensions have resulted in deaths on a massive scale, the erasure of entire populations, and fundamental violations of the fabric of reality itself. If there were cosmic laws governing time travel and dimensional travel, Brian would be guilty of breaking every single one of them. Let's start with the basic concept of timeline manipulation. Every time Brian and Stewie travel through time and change something, they're potentially altering the lives of billions of people. They're erasing timelines where certain people existed and replacing them with timelines where those people never existed or existed differently. From an ethical and potentially legal standpoint, erasing someone from existence by changing the past is a form of murder. You're ending their life, even if you're doing it by preventing them from ever being born, rather than by killing them directly. Brian and Stewie have done this countless times across their various time travel adventures. The Native American timeline incident is one of the most extreme examples. In one episode, Brian and Stewie travel back to colonial times, and Stewie gives advanced weapons to Native Americans. This changes history so that Native Americans wipe out European colonizers instead of the other way around. The result is an alternate present where Native Americans control North America and Europeans never established colonies. Now, there are complex moral questions about colonialism and whether preventing European colonization would have been a good thing. But from a purely quantitative standpoint, Brian and Stewie's actions resulted in the deaths of every European colonizer who would have survived in the original timeline. That's potentially thousands of deaths that they directly caused through their reckless alteration of history. But it gets worse, because their timeline manipulation doesn't just affect the people who died differently. It affects everyone who would have been born in the original timeline, but doesn't exist in the altered timeline. Every descendant of those European colonizers who never got to exist because Brian and Stewie changed history is essentially a victim of their reckless time travel. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of people who were erased from existence because Brian and Stewie couldn't be more careful with incredibly dangerous technology. The legal framework for prosecuting timeline manipulation doesn't exist in our world, obviously, because we don't have time travel. But if we extrapolate from existing laws about reckless endangerment and negligent homicide, what Brian and Stewie are doing with time travel would be criminally negligent at minimum. They have technology that can alter reality on a massive scale, and they treat it like a toy. They use it for personal convenience. They take joyrides through history. They make changes without thinking through the consequences. This is like giving nuclear launch codes to someone who uses them to settle personal grudges. The scale of potential harm is so enormous that any use of this technology without extreme caution should be considered criminal. The multiverse crimes are similar, but operate on an even larger scale. When Brian and Stewie travel between parallel universes, they encounter versions of themselves and others who exist in those realities. These alternate versions are fully real people with their own lives and consciousness. They're not copies or simulations. They're actual living beings who exist in parallel dimensions. And Brian and Stewie regularly endanger, harm, or even kill these alternate versions of people without any apparent moral consideration. There's an episode where Brian and Stewie jump between multiple parallel universes, and in the process, they cause chaos and destruction in several of them. They don't stick around to fix the problems they cause. They just jump to the next universe, leaving behind devastation and potentially deaths in the universes they've abandoned. Each of these universes is populated by billions of real people who didn't ask to have their reality disrupted by dimensional travelers. Brian and Stewie treating these universes as playgrounds demonstrates a complete disregard for the sanctity of life across multiple realities. The universe destruction risks are perhaps the most serious aspect of Brian and Stewie's time travel and multiverse adventures. There are episodes that suggest their reckless tampering with time and dimensions could potentially destroy entire universes or cause them to collapse into each other. This isn't just theoretical risk. There are moments where they come very close to causing catastrophic failure of reality itself. If they had succeeded in breaking the universe, that would be mass murder on a scale that includes literally everyone who exists. That's genocide times infinity. That's the ultimate crime. The indirect deaths they've caused through timeline and multiverse manipulation are hard to quantify precisely because we don't see most of the consequences of their actions play out on screen. But we can infer that every time they change something significant in the past, there are ripple effects that result in different people being born, different people dying at different times, and potentially massive historical changes that affect millions or billions of lives. Brian and Stewie are essentially playing God with reality, and they're doing it carelessly, selfishly, and without any kind of oversight or accountability. There's also the question of consent. The people whose lives are altered or erased by timeline manipulation never consented to having their existence changed or ended. They didn't agree to be part of Brian and Stewie's experiments with reality. They were just living their lives. And then suddenly, their entire existence was rewritten or erased because two individuals from another timeline decided to mess around with history. This is a profound violation of autonomy on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. The creation of alternate timelines raises interesting legal questions too. When Brian and Stewie create a new timeline by changing the past, are they responsible for everything that happens in that timeline as a result of their changes? If their actions lead to a war in an alternate timeline, are they guilty of causing that war? If people in the alternate timeline suffer because of the changes they made, are Brian and Stewie liable for that suffering? Under any reasonable ethical framework, the answer has to be yes. When you have the power to alter reality, and you choose to use that power recklessly, you're responsible for the consequences. The road to episodes, where Brian and Stewie travel to various alternate dimensions and time periods, consistently show them treating these adventures as entertainment. They're tourists in other realities, looking for interesting sights and experiences, with no regard for how their presence might affect the places they visit or the people they encounter. In one universe, they cause a disturbance that likely resulted in deaths. In another, they steal something valuable and escape back to their home dimension before facing consequences. They're like the worst kind of tourists, except instead of just being rude and disrespectful, they're potentially causing deaths and altering the course of civilizations. The violation of cosmic laws is more philosophical than legal, but it's worth considering. If time travel and dimensional travel exist, there are presumably rules about how they should be used. Don't create paradoxes. Don't alter major historical events. Don't interact with past or alternate versions of yourself in ways that could cause problems. Don't steal technology from other time periods. Don't introduce anachronistic elements to past societies. Brian and Stewie violate every single one of these reasonable rules repeatedly. They create paradoxes. They alter history. They meet past and alternate versions of themselves. They steal and borrow technology across time periods. They give advanced weapons to people in the past. They do everything wrong. The time machine itself is arguably an illegal weapon of mass destruction. It's technology that can be used to alter reality, erase populations, and cause death on an unimaginable scale. Possessing such technology without government oversight, without safety protocols, without any kind of regulation or accountability, is inherently dangerous and should probably be illegal, even if specific laws don't exist yet. Stewie building the time machine in his bedroom and using it for personal adventures is like someone building a nuclear bomb in their garage and using it to do landscaping. The potential for catastrophic harm is so enormous that merely possessing this technology should be considered a crime. Brian's role in all of this is particularly important because he's the adult in this partnership. Stewie is a baby, albeit a genius baby with advanced knowledge and technology. But Brian is a grown dog with years of life experience. He should know better than to participate in reckless time travel adventures. He should be the voice of reason, telling Stewie that maybe they shouldn't alter the timeline or jump between dimensions without understanding the consequences. Instead, Brian is an enthusiastic participant in these adventures. He encourages them. He suggests destinations. He helps plan their trips through time and space. Brian is an active and willing accomplice in crimes against reality itself. The cumulative impact of Brian and Stewie's time travel and multiverse crimes is staggering. If we tried to count every person whose life was altered or ended by their actions, we'd be counting in the millions, at minimum, possibly billions, depending on how broadly the timeline changes rippled out. If we tried to quantify the potential destruction they risked by their reckless handling of reality-altering technology, we'd be talking about the potential end of all existence across multiple universes. These aren't minor crimes. These aren't even major crimes on a human scale. These are crimes against the very fabric of existence, committed casually and repeatedly by a talking dog who thinks he's too smart to face consequences. The fact that Brian and Stewie eventually destroy the time machine doesn't absolve them of responsibility for all the crimes they committed using it. Destroying the evidence of your crimes doesn't make those crimes go away. All the people they killed through timeline manipulation are still dead. All the alternate universes they damaged are still dealing with the consequences of their actions. The destruction of the time machine just means they can't commit any more of these specific crimes in the future, which is good, but it doesn't address the massive harm they've already caused. If there were some kind of cosmic court that had jurisdiction over time, travel, and dimensional crimes, Brian would be facing charges that include negligent homicide on a massive scale, reckless endangerment of entire universes, unauthorized possession and use of reality-altering technology, violation of temporal causality, destruction of alternate timelines, and crimes against existence itself. The sentence for such crimes would have to be measured in geological timescales, because no finite human lifespan would be sufficient punishment for the magnitude of harm Brian has caused, or nearly caused, through his reckless adventures across time and space. After examining all of Brian's crimes, all of his terrible behavior, all of the ways he's hurt people throughout the series, a pattern emerges that goes beyond just being a bad person or making poor choices. The pattern suggests that Brian Griffin might actually be a sociopath. Not in the casual, insulting way people sometimes throw that term around, but in the actual clinical sense. Brian demonstrates consistent traits that align with antisocial personality disorder, the formal diagnosis that encompasses what people commonly call sociopathy. His behavior isn't just bad. It's pathological. It's a persistent pattern of disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and a grandiose sense of self-importance that pervades every aspect of his character. Let's start with the narcissism, because that's perhaps Brian's most obvious personality trait. Narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder often overlap, and Brian displays characteristics of both. He has an inflated sense of his own importance. He believes he's smarter, more cultured, more sophisticated than everyone around him. This isn't just healthy self-confidence. This is pathological grandiosity. Brian genuinely believes that he's operating on a different level than other people, that his thoughts and opinions and experiences are more valuable than anyone else's. This grandiosity manifests in how Brian talks about himself and his accomplishments. He constantly brings up the fact that he went to Brown University, even though he dropped out before graduating. He mentions his writing career even though his books have been commercial and critical failures. He references his political activism, even though his activism consists mostly of talking about issues rather than doing anything substantive to address them. Brian builds his identity around these supposed accomplishments, inflating their importance and using them to justify his sense of superiority over others. The narcissism also shows up in how Brian handles criticism. When someone criticizes him, Brian doesn't engage with the substance of the criticism. He doesn't consider whether the criticism might be valid, or whether he might need to change his behavior. Instead, he immediately becomes defensive. He attacks the person criticizing him. He makes excuses. He shifts blame. He does anything and everything to avoid accepting that maybe, just maybe, he's not as wonderful as he thinks he is. This inability to accept criticism or acknowledge his own flaws is a hallmark of narcissistic personality disorder. Quagmire's famous speech about why he hates Brian is particularly revealing because it lists, very specifically, all of Brian's narcissistic traits. Quagmire points out that Brian talks about himself constantly, that he pretends to be smarter than he actually is, that he judges everyone else while never examining his own behavior, that he takes credit for things he didn't do and blames others for his failures. Every single thing Quagmire says in that speech is an accurate observation of narcissistic behavior. And Brian's response to this devastating critique? He doesn't reflect on it. He doesn't try to change. He just gets angry at Quagmire and holds a grudge. The lack of empathy is another key indicator that Brian might be a sociopath. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, to recognize their pain and suffering as real and important. Brian lacks this capacity in any meaningful way. He can intellectually understand that his actions hurt people. He knows on a cognitive level that stealing is wrong or that lying damages relationships, but he doesn't feel it emotionally. He doesn't experience genuine remorse or guilt when he hurts people. He might say he's sorry when it's strategically advantageous to do so, but those apologies are hollow. They're tools for manipulation rather than expressions of genuine regret. We can see Brian's lack of empathy in how he treats the people closest to him. He manipulates Lois despite knowing that his advances make her uncomfortable. He uses Jillian for her looks and her money while having contempt for her intelligence. He helps Stewie commit crimes that endanger people. He treats Peter like an idiot, despite Peter being his best friend and benefactor. In every relationship, Brian prioritizes his own needs and wants over the well-being of the other person. He's incapable of truly caring about someone else's suffering if it conflicts with what he wants. The manipulation is constant and deliberate. Sociopaths are often highly skilled at manipulation because they understand intellectually how people think and what motivates them, even if they don't feel emotional connections to others. Brian uses this intellectual understanding to manipulate people into giving him what he wants. He lies smoothly and convincingly. He crafts narratives that make him look good and others look bad. He plays on people's emotions, their insecurities, their desires, all while feeling nothing himself except the satisfaction of successfully manipulating someone. There's a calculated quality to Brian's manipulation that's particularly disturbing. He doesn't just lie in the moment to get out of trouble. He plans elaborate deceptions. He creates false identities. He maintains complex webs of lies over extended periods. This requires sustained effort and a complete comfort with deception that most people don't have. Normal people feel guilty when they lie, especially to people they care about. That guilt eventually becomes uncomfortable enough that they either confess or stop lying. Brian never reaches that point because he doesn't feel that guilt in any meaningful way. The fake moral high ground that Brian constantly occupies is perhaps the most infuriating aspect of his sociopathy. Brian positions himself as the moral arbiter of the Griffin family, and often of Quahog in general. He lectures people about politics, religion, ethics, and social issues. He acts like he has profound insights into right and wrong. He presents himself as someone who cares deeply about justice and fairness, but his actions completely contradict his words. He's a hypocrite of the highest order, preaching morality while consistently behaving immorally. This hypocrisy isn't just garden variety inconsistency between beliefs and actions. It's a fundamental disconnect between Brian's self-image and reality. Brian genuinely seems to believe that he's a good person, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This is a common trait among sociopaths. They can commit terrible acts without experiencing cognitive dissonance because they've constructed a narrative where they're still the hero of their own story. Brian has convinced himself that he's intelligent, cultured, and morally superior, and no amount of evidence of his terrible behavior can penetrate that delusion. The acting woke and intelligent while behaving worse than everyone else is a specific manifestation of Brian's sociopathy that's particularly relevant to his character. Brian uses progressive politics and intellectual interests as a costume. He wears these things like accessories that make him look good, but he doesn't actually embody the values he claims to hold. He talks about feminism while sexually harassing women. He advocates for animal rights while abusing animals. He lectures about social justice while treating everyone around him terribly. The disconnect between his stated values and his actual behavior reveals that his progressive persona is just another manipulation, another way to make himself look good and feel superior. The pattern of behavior across the series shows that Brian's sociopathy isn't just a phase or a reaction to specific circumstances. It's consistent. It's pervasive. It affects every area of his life and every relationship he has. From the earliest seasons to the most recent episodes, Brian demonstrates the same core traits: narcissism, lack of empathy, manipulation, grandiosity, refusal to accept responsibility. These traits don't change. They don't improve. If anything, they get worse as the series progresses, and the writers lean into Brian's darker characteristics. The question of whether Brian is capable of change is important when considering whether he's truly a sociopath. One of the defining features of antisocial personality disorder is that it's extremely resistant to treatment. Sociopaths rarely change their behavior in any meaningful way because they don't believe they need to change. They don't experience the internal discomfort that motivates most people to grow and improve. Brian demonstrates this resistance to change throughout the series. He faces consequences for his behavior occasionally, but those consequences never result in genuine personal growth. He doesn't learn from his mistakes. He just gets better at avoiding consequences. There are moments where Brian seems to have genuine emotional connections, particularly with Stewie. Their friendship appears to involve real affection and loyalty. This might seem to contradict the idea that Brian is a sociopath, since sociopaths supposedly can't form genuine emotional bonds. But research suggests that sociopaths can form selective attachments to specific individuals, even if they lack empathy for people in general. Brian's relationship with Stewie might be the one exception to his otherwise consistent pattern of using people for his own benefit. Or it might be that Brian values Stewie because Stewie makes him feel important and provides him with exciting adventures, which would mean even this seemingly genuine friendship is actually based on what Stewie can do for Brian. The impact of Brian's sociopathy on everyone around him is profound. People who interact with Brian regularly often end up hurt, confused, or manipulated. His ex-girlfriends have a whole list of complaints about how he mistreated them. His family members have been betrayed by him countless times. His colleagues and acquaintances have been used and discarded when they were no longer useful. Brian leaves a trail of damaged relationships and hurt people wherever he goes, and he never seems to recognize or care about the harm he causes. The self-awareness question is fascinating with Brian because he sometimes displays what appears to be self-awareness about his flaws. He occasionally admits that he's selfish or that he has problems with women. But this apparent self-awareness never translates into actual change. It's more like Brian has learned that acknowledging his flaws superficially can be useful for diffusing criticism. He can say, "Yeah, I know I have issues," as a way to avoid actually addressing those issues. This is another manipulation tactic common among sociopaths: the false confession that creates the appearance of insight and willingness to change without requiring any actual change. The comparison to other characters in Family Guy is instructive. Peter is an idiot who causes chaos through stupidity rather than malice. Stewie is a baby with grandiose schemes, but who also displays genuine emotional vulnerability and capacity for growth. Quagmire is deeply flawed and has committed terrible acts, but he owns his awfulness rather than pretending to be better than he is. Brian is unique among the main characters in combining terrible behavior with a complete lack of self-awareness and a persistent delusion that he's actually a good person. That combination of traits, terrible behavior, plus delusional self-image, plus lack of genuine empathy, is what makes Brian's psychology so consistent with sociopathy. The clinical criteria for antisocial personality disorder include things like failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, and aggressiveness, reckless disregard for safety of self or others, consistent irresponsibility, and lack of remorse. Brian hits every single one of these criteria. He regularly breaks laws and social norms. He's deceitful in virtually every interaction. He acts impulsively, especially when drunk or pursuing women. He's aggressive when criticized or challenged. He endangers himself and others through drunk driving and other reckless behavior. He's irresponsible about work, relationships, and his obligations to others. And he demonstrates a complete lack of genuine remorse for any of his actions. If Brian were a real person rather than a cartoon character, a psychologist evaluating him would almost certainly diagnose him with antisocial personality disorder, probably with narcissistic features. His behavior pattern is textbook. The prognosis for someone with this diagnosis is generally poor. Antisocial personality disorder doesn't typically improve with age or treatment. People with this disorder continue to harm others throughout their lives, and they rarely experience the kind of insight or motivation that would lead to genuine change. Brian's trajectory throughout the series supports this prognosis. He doesn't get better. He gets worse. His crimes become more serious. His manipulation becomes more elaborate. His narcissism becomes more pronounced. This is consistent with the typical life course of someone with untreated antisocial personality disorder. So here we are, after hours of examining Brian Griffin's criminal record, after cataloging every terrible thing he's done across more than 20 seasons of Family Guy. The question we need to answer now is simple. Should Brian Griffin actually be in prison? And if we're being honest, if we're looking at this with any kind of objectivity, the answer is absolutely, unequivocally, yes. Brian should be in prison for the rest of his natural life, possibly multiple life sentences running consecutively, with no possibility of parole. The sheer volume and severity of his crimes make this conclusion unavoidable. Let's recap everything we've covered, because the totality of Brian's criminal behavior is staggering when you see it all laid out together. We started with the early crimes and misconduct, the alcoholism that led to countless instances of public intoxication, the assault on police officers and resisting arrest, the stalking behavior toward Lois that began almost immediately after Brian moved into the Griffin household. These early crimes established the pattern that would define Brian's character throughout the series, a pattern of entitlement, boundary violations, and a fundamental belief that laws and social norms don't apply to him. Then we move to Brian's crimes against Quahog society, the vandalism, the reckless destruction of property, the drunk driving that endangered countless innocent people, the breaking and entering into homes and businesses, the trespassing on private property. These crimes demonstrated that Brian isn't just a problem for the Griffin family. He's a menace to the entire community. The financial damage alone would run into the millions of dollars if anyone ever tried to calculate the full cost of Brian's destructive behavior. The drug crimes were extensive and disturbing. Brian's cocaine addiction, where he stole drugs from police evidence and used them extensively. His marijuana possession and use, which would have been illegal for most of the series' timeline. The distribution of drugs to Stewie, a minor, which is one of the most serious drug crimes you can commit. The repeated instances of driving under the influence of both alcohol and drugs. If Brian faced prosecution for just his drug crimes, he'd be looking at decades in federal prison before we even got to any of his other offenses. Brian's role as Stewie's accomplice added another massive category of crimes: aiding in multiple kidnappings, helping to build weapons of mass destruction, participating in conspiracy to commit terrorism, being an accessory to attempted murder. The time travel crimes that resulted in deaths across multiple timelines. Brian didn't just stand by and watch Stewie commit these crimes. He actively participated. He helped plan them. He provided material support. Under the law, that makes him just as guilty as if he'd committed these crimes himself. The crimes against women revealed perhaps the darkest aspect of Brian's character: the stalking, the harassment, the manipulation and emotional abuse of every woman he dated, the sexual assault and attempted rape, the fraud and deception he used to trick women into relationships, the cyber stalking and real-world stalking that terrorized multiple victims. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a consistent pattern that demonstrated Brian's fundamental inability to see women as human beings deserving of respect and autonomy. The white-collar crimes showed Brian's calculated criminality: years of tax evasion, fraud in his writing career, charity scams, identity theft, false income reporting. These crimes required planning and sustained deception. They weren't heat-of-the-moment mistakes. They were deliberate, ongoing criminal enterprises that Brian engaged in to enrich himself and maintain his false image as a successful intellectual. The crimes against other animals exposed Brian's profound hypocrisy. Despite positioning himself as someone who cares about animal welfare, Brian discriminated against, abused, and even killed other dogs. He participated in dogfighting. He betrayed his own species for personal gain. These crimes were particularly damning because they revealed that even Brian's supposedly principled stances on issues were hollow and self-serving. The violence and attempted murders elevated Brian's criminality to the most serious level. The deliberate murder of another sentient dog. Multiple attempted murders of Quagmire and others. The negligent homicide that resulted from his drunk driving and reckless behavior. The casual murder of an innocent waiter just for target practice. These weren't cartoon violence. These were serious crimes that ended or nearly ended real lives. The time travel and multiverse crimes operated on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. Deaths across multiple timelines. The erasure of entire populations through reckless timeline manipulation. Endangering entire universes through careless handling of reality-altering technology. If these crimes could be prosecuted, the charges would include genocide, crimes against existence itself, and reckless endangerment on a cosmic scale. And finally, the psychological profile that suggests Brian is an actual sociopath. The narcissism, the lack of empathy, the manipulation, the grandiosity, the persistent pattern of harmful behavior combined with complete inability to accept responsibility or change. This isn't just someone making bad choices. This is someone with a fundamental deficit in their capacity to care about other people. When you add it all up, when you look at the complete picture of Brian Griffin's criminal record, you're looking at someone who has committed virtually every serious crime you can name: murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, drug trafficking, sexual assault, fraud, tax evasion, identity theft, assault on police officers, drunk driving, stalking, harassment, animal abuse, terrorism. The list goes on and on. If Brian were prosecuted for even a fraction of these crimes, the sentence would be measured in centuries. He would need multiple consecutive life sentences to even begin to address the severity of his criminal behavior. The question of whether Brian would survive prison is actually interesting to consider. Prison is dangerous, especially for inmates who have committed crimes against children or who are perceived as weak or vulnerable. Brian gave drugs to a minor. He's a talking dog who would stand out immediately. He's physically small compared to most adult humans. He's pretentious and would likely irritate other inmates with his intellectual superiority act. Brian would either need to be in protective custody for his entire sentence, or he'd likely be attacked by other inmates within days or weeks of arriving at a standard prison facility. But honestly, whether Brian would survive prison is less important than the fact that he absolutely deserves to be there. The harm Brian has caused to individuals, families, communities, and potentially entire realities is enormous. He's hurt countless people through his crimes. He's destroyed property. He's endangered lives. He's manipulated and abused vulnerable people. He's shown no remorse and no capacity for change. Everything about Brian's character and behavior suggests that he's a danger to everyone around him, and that the only way to protect society from him would be to remove him from society permanently. The fact that Brian never faces real consequences in the show is one of the most unrealistic elements of Family Guy. And that's saying something for a show that features a talking baby with a time machine. In any remotely realistic universe, Brian would have been arrested dozens of times. He'd have multiple felony convictions. He'd be a registered sex offender. He'd be prohibited from owning firearms, from living near schools, from having unsupervised contact with minors. He'd be on parole or probation for the rest of his life. And most likely, he'd be in prison serving multiple life sentences for his most serious crimes. The cultural impact of Brian Griffin is interesting too because for many years, he was one of the more popular characters on Family Guy. People related to his intellectual pretensions and his cynical worldview. He was supposed to be the voice of reason, the character who called out the absurdity around him. But as the series progressed, and Brian's crimes and character flaws became more pronounced, fan opinion shifted. People started to realize that Brian wasn't the hero of the show. He was, in many ways, the worst person in it. The fact that Brian was killed off in season 12, even temporarily, suggests that even the writers recognized that the character had become irredeemable. When Brian did return after his temporary death, he didn't come back as a reformed character. He came back as the same narcissistic, manipulative, criminal dog he'd always been. The brief absence didn't teach him anything. It didn't make him appreciate his life or his relationships more. It just gave him a temporary reprieve before he went right back to his old patterns of terrible behavior. This confirmed what we'd already suspected. Brian is incapable of change. He's locked into his personality and his criminal patterns in ways that make him genuinely dangerous and completely unsympathetic. So yes, Brian Griffin deserves to be in prison. He deserves to face consequences for his crimes. He deserves to be held accountable for the harm he's caused. The fact that he never faces these consequences in the show doesn't change the reality that in any just universe, Brian would be behind bars for the rest of his life. He's not the intellectual voice of reason. He's not the moral center of the Griffin family. He's a criminal, a predator, and a sociopath who has gotten away with terrible crimes for far too long. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through Brian Griffin's criminal record. If you've made it this far, thanks for sticking around for this deep dive into everything wrong with one of television's most problematic cartoon dogs. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we've got plenty more content like this coming your way. Sleep well, and try not to have nightmares about talking dogs with criminal tendencies.